These are the times that try men's souls. American Revolutionary War patriot Thomas Paine's words carry with them a warning about the cost of commitment, of believing in ideals, and making the hard choice. Between 1964 and 1973, over 2.5 million Americans made the hard choice to serve in America's longest war, the war in Vietnam. The sacrifice of these servicemen and women was real. And yet in the ensuing years, the veterans of Vietnam and their families have been embattled in a new conflict, a struggle against the myth that has distorted who they are and why they serve.
There is a dramatic difference between my experience and what I know to be the truth and what the general person in the American public believes.
A person who hasn't experienced that and hasn't seen the Vietnamese and seen the war can't really make an intelligent comment about somebody who has.
If you were in Vietnam, the myth is sort of a disgrace to the people who died.
The Vietnam War clearly was not like World War II, where the glorious victory of the United States and our allies was told over and over and over and over again, all my young life and to this day.
We're getting up in age, and if we don't correct this now, our history, in effect, has already been written, and it's going to stay there forever. You know, if we don't challenge it now, it's not going to get challenged.
Heavy U.S. commitment in Vietnam began in the autumn of 1964, culminating in a peace treaty nearly a decade later. However, the seeds of the conflict began nearly 20 years earlier, at the end of World War II. At that time, the Communist Soviet Union formed part of the forces that defeated our mutual adversary, Nazi Germany. In the aftermath of the war, however, it became clear that our former ally had aggressive designs of its own. Under the leadership of the Soviets, international communism began a 40-year campaign to subvert and replace existing governments in many parts of the world. We were warned not to stand in their way. Speaking at the United Nations in 1960, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev threatened, "We will bury you." Americans took warnings like this seriously. Since the late 1940s, we and our post-war allies had been working to counter the Soviets. The moves and counter-moves formed what came to be known as the Cold War. Nowhere did this Cold War play out on a larger scale or more tragically than in Vietnam. And for the American veterans of that war, like Dallas attorney Rob Hartman, one of the lasting tragedies has been the myth that they were forced into serving their country.
Well, I think I was serving with America. I mean, nearly everybody I saw was there, for one reason or another, and mostly volunteers, an awful lot of volunteers, and solid people. I mean, people over there to get a job done, people going there because their country asked them to.
The men who were over there were very dedicated to what they were doing. They were not reluctant soldiers that went screaming and kicking. 75% of us volunteered to go to Vietnam. That is as opposed to the World War II vet, where only 33% of World War II vets voluntarily enlisted. So there's a lot of things about the men and women who served over there that are absolutely proof that they were the best and brightest of my generation. They were not the dregs of society, nor of my generation. They were the best of my generation.
We're fortunate to live in this democracy, and when our country asks us to go, we go.
I felt that I wanted to be in the military, and so I think that when we all finished flying school, we acknowledged that Vietnam was the place that we were supposed to go. It was not only an obligation and an expectation, but that was something that we had decided. The day I signed in was the day I began volunteering for Vietnam.
I was not going to seek a deferment to to stay out of the military, and sure enough, they started drafting according to the lottery number, and in the local draft board, number 96 came up for the month of April of 1969, and I went off to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri.
I had decided to go infantry, largely because my father said that tanks were too easy to find on the battlefield if you're a pilot. So, and I figured this war was more of an infantry war. So I went infantry and volunteered to go to Vietnam.
I guess what got me interested in serving my country and going in the military was my grandfather had served in the Army Signal Corps during World War I in France. And then my dad served in World War II in the Army Air Corps in the South Pacific. And so it seemed to me to be the thing to do. And I wasn't too interested in going to college. And it just seemed like an adventure to me and something I wanted to do.
Well, I grew up going to Grandma's house, and over top of Grandma's TV set, the actual focal point of any family unit was the picture of my Uncle Thomas, who I never met. Uncle Thomas was a navigator in a B-17 during World War II and was lost over the English Channel, and his body was never found. So all of those years, it was ingrained in me that eventually it could, would, should be my turn.
Well, my father passed when I was 15 years old, and when he died, it was rough for my mother because of the fact that she had never had to work before. She just always was a housewife. So all of a sudden, she had to become the breadwinner of the family. So she continued running the store that my father had left, and she continued to send two of my sisters to school. So when I graduated from high school, I did not want to put that burden on her any more than what she already had. So I did not go to college. I joined the military so that I could support myself and help my mother as well.
Whether a veteran had enlisted or answered their draft call, they served willingly. It was an emotional time, and the families shared the burden of their decision.
Probably the most difficult 2 hours or 3 hours of my life was from the time we left our home at my parents' home in Oskaloosa, Iowa, with my wife and daughter, knowing that when we get to the airport, step on the airplane, somebody might kill you before you get back. And I don't think anybody that has not been through it will ever realize what it was.
The hardest part of going to Vietnam for me was the period before, anticipating what was definitely going to happen, which would be mutilation, capture, torture. Death was the least of my worries. So the anticipation of that horror that you saw on television or in the newspapers, and you conjured up in your own mind because it was going to happen to me.
And I knew that my parents had done it, and therefore I didn't know why we couldn't do it.
The actual moment of leaving my family at the Pittsburgh airport for the last time, that I thought would be the last time, and finding out subsequently that my mother knew, she felt strongly that she would not see Russell Gary Smith again, because just like her brother, her son would die in a war, because that's what happened to families like ours.
Anyway, we kissed goodbye and got on the airplane and flew to San Francisco, Oakland, and spent a few days at the Oakland Processing Center, and then we got on the Big Bird and we went to Anchorage and we went to Yokota, Japan, and we landed in Long Binh. And that's how I got to Vietnam.
Most Vietnam veterans grew up in the relative domestic calm following World War II. However, as Cold War tensions grew, the possibility of nuclear war was a reality even children had to learn to live with. By the late 1950s, America was poised to enter a period of social and cultural upheaval. Our new president, John F. Kennedy, was a decorated World War II veteran. In his 1961 inaugural address, JFK challenged us to ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. True to Khrushchev's threat the previous autumn, the Soviets were secretly placing missiles armed with nuclear warheads in Cuba, right in our nation's backyard. The subsequent Cuban Missile Crisis brought us to the edge of nuclear war, only 8 months into the Kennedy administration. Meanwhile, halfway around the world, other events had been playing out that would draw our nation into the epic struggle of the Cold War, the war in Vietnam. The fighting force that would represent America in that struggle would be made up largely of poor and minorities and those with little education, or so we've been told. Vietnam veteran and author of Stolen Valor, B.G. Burkett, has confronted this belief on a regular basis.
Well, one of the great myths that most people have is that the men who served in Vietnam are predominantly from the minority, the underclass, the socioeconomic strata that couldn't get a deferment in college. That's totally false. We had the highest education group of any military America's ever put on the field of battle.
All of the officers clearly were college educated. All of them were rescue pilots. All of them were in that kind of frame of mind. The enlisted, all of them were high school graduates. Many of them had ambitions to go back to college and complete college. They were all very professional.
We were all going to college. That was the pattern that was set, and I was going in the military. You know, I was the son of a World War II vet, and it didn't matter whether there was a war or peacetime or what. I knew the culture. It is a very good testing ground for a young man, getting started out in terms of the skills you can learn and the leadership and all that. So all of that was a given. I mean, it didn't even dawn on us to take any other path.
The soldiers that I served with were just splendid. And what you have to remember, I guess, back in those days, you really got a variety of people that you served with, because the draft was on back then too. So you got a wide range of educations, a wide range of backgrounds, a wide range of interests.
The Vietnam War, I graduated college in 1966, so the war was going full blown. Went down to the recruiter my Christmas vacation my senior year, visited all the various branches, decided what I wanted to do, and basically volunteered for the Army. And I went in, was inducted 1 month after I graduated from college to go to OCS.
Once I graduated college, of course, I was looking forward to some time in the military. As an accountant, and the fact that I had probably at that point 3 full years of experience in accounting, I was sure I'd be in the finance corps. And if we look back during that period of time, of course, computers were just coming in. My gosh, I thought this is a tremendous opportunity for me to learn about computers and serve the military. One of my best friends at that time was just beside me, had no knowledge of accounting, nothing as far as computers. We both went in for our assignment. He got the finance corps, and of course, I got the artillery.
I graduated from Penn State in the Navy ROTC program and was commissioned a second lieutenant, or an ensign as the Navy calls them, and was told that I would be going off to Philadelphia Navy Yard for my tour. And I thought that's pretty neat, because at that point in the war, no one was really raising their hand and saying, gee, I want to go over and help them finish that thing up over there.
My plans, I think, solidified in high school in that, I guess based on my father, he was kind of my hero, I had decided to go into the military. So during high school, my goal was to try to get accepted at either the Air Force Academy at West Point, and failing that, I would go to either University of Michigan, since he was from Michigan, or I guess Princeton was the other school.
I went out to public affairs school at an Army base in Indiana, and the first day there was told that my orders had been changed and I wouldn't be going off to Philadelphia, that I would be spending the next 12 months as an assistant public affairs officer in country. Far beyond my greatest fears, I figured the worst case scenario would be I would be on a big gray boat somewhere on an admiral's staff as a public affairs officer. I have a red-green color deficiency. There were all these sorts of things that led me to believe that I probably wouldn't be going off to Vietnam. Well, it's the only place the Navy ever sent me.
At that point in time, it was a faraway country. It was a faraway war. I was getting a degree in teacher education. I was planning on teaching industrial arts for the rest of my life, and Going into the military was the farthest thing from my imagination because I knew that I would never have to serve in Vietnam. I knew that, hey, college graduate and a degree and a teacher, you'll never see Vietnam.
During that time period, it just dawned on me that if I went back to New Mexico State and got my master's degree, I could finish my ROTC training and get a commission and also complete my master's work. So that's what I did. I went back to New Mexico State, got my master's, and got commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Army, and graduated in 1967, which was just in time to get into the fun of Vietnam.
It would be years before the soldiers you have just met were to serve in combat. But like an approaching storm just glimpsed over the horizon, a complex set of circumstances led irresistibly to an American commitment to fight. First of all, Vietnam occupies a strategic position in Southeast Asia. It is a long, narrow country formed by the Mekong River Delta in the south, the Central Highlands, and the delta and flatlands of the Red River in the north. Vietnam faces the South China Sea and backs to low mountains that divide it from its neighbors to the west, Laos and Cambodia. All of what is Vietnam today had been controlled by France as Indochina since the mid-19th century. After the Second World War, French efforts to retain their former colony collapsed at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in May of 1954. There, French forces were trapped by a larger communist-supported Vietnamese force led by General Von Nguyen Giap. The resulting Geneva Conference on Indochina divided Vietnam roughly in half. The northern portion would be controlled by the communists, with the south remaining non-communist. In an ominous precursor of things to come, 1 million North Vietnamese Catholics and ethnic Chinese fled persecution in an exodus to the south. Only 12 months before, the South Koreans and the United States had fought the North Korean and Chinese communists to a bloody standoff that divided Korea in a similar manner. Soliciting aid from the same communist Chinese that had attempted to take all of Korea, the North Vietnamese wasted no time. Almost immediately, they initiated efforts to gain control over the South and the fertile Mekong Delta. The United States was led during this period by former World War II Allied Supreme Commander General Dwight Eisenhower. President Eisenhower felt that South Vietnam should continue as a democracy, however flawed. It would serve as an example to the communist bloc that they could expect strong resistance from the United States. America suffered her first casualties when 2 U.S. military advisors were killed in May of 1959 near the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon. With Soviet and Communist Chinese arms and directly aided by North Vietnam, the Viet Cong communist guerrillas stepped up their efforts to control the South. Fresh from his successful confrontation with the Soviets over Cuba, President Kennedy was strongly motivated to order a notable increase in American support. Conversely, it has often been said that as the war heated up, the soldiers themselves were not motivated and that they often suffered from low morale.
I had a pretty good concept of Vietnam just from friends of my father, and of course I was in an armored division for a year before that. An awful lot of men that I was serving with were Vietnam veterans, and they had films and slides and that kind of thing. So it was not, I mean, it was like going to a travel spot that you'd already seen most of the, most of the places, but the culture and the people, it took a lot of, getting used to in terms of trying to communicate and that type of thing. But it wasn't an unpleasant experience. I mean, it was not this, dig a hole and cover yourself up because you're going to die in the morning kind of thing.
What we saw and what we experienced, when coupled with what we read in the Stars and Stripes, or what we got on Good Morning America, Good Morning Vietnam, that was that time, gave us an impression that we were in Vietnam because of an honorable reason, for an honorable cause, and that we were there to stop communism in its tracks. And so that's what we were there for.
I think the feeling when I was there is that the Vietnamese were very happy to have our assistance, and they were very grateful that we were there. And it was very much the sense that we were there to help them. And I think the people that I was with felt very good about that mission.
We had one particular Vietnamese gentleman who was probably in his 50s, which was very old age probably in those days back there. And he had come down from North Vietnam when the communists took over North Vietnam. And so, you know, it was very real to him what we were fighting for. He was one of those that had escaped the communists, and so I think that they did appreciate what we were doing.
There was very much a sense that, you know, we were America, we always stood for the right things, we were over there for the right reasons, and we were there to help them.
With the men that I served with in Vietnam, I would say that I probably made some of the best friends I'll ever have in my life there, and yet we basically lost contact now. And the other thing is, I came to the conclusion that if I ever go to war, I want a bunch of Marines around me.
A rescue detachment is a pretty small detachment. As I remember, there were probably about 5 or 6 pilots, or maybe 6 or 7 pilots, with maybe twice that number in enlisted. The group was very tight. They were very close. We all lived together when we were on alert. We all lived in a trailer right on the flight line. We drank beer together. We cooked steaks together. We played gin together. We had softball teams, and we played. And so it was a very congenial group.
But it was exciting. It was interesting to meet with the people and actually try and communicate with them and do good works for them. We played volleyball with the kids. We'd cut hair, and we'd pass out soap, and we'd show movies at night. We had a little generator set, and we'd put up sheets, and we'd show Disney movies, and they'd get a kick out of that. Of course, we had to show a little bit of the accomplishments of the Vietnamese government by film clip too toward the end. But it was a very interesting time.
We weren't aware of the protesting that was occurring, or that would begin in the States. And in fact, I think when we first heard about that, we were very shocked and surprised, because we believed that what we were doing was the right thing to do, and we were appalled.
Because we ate together, slept together, fought together, set up ambushes together, and lost comrades in common. There's the bond that's formed, but I don't believe I've ever had that type of bond in any other, whether it's a vocation or any other relationship in my life. Those individuals truly were individuals that we came to depend on, know their personal likes, their dislikes, their temperaments. It was, as an example, April of this last year, for the first time in 30 years, we had the occasion to have a reunion of our unit. And within a few hours, it almost seemed like there hadn't been 30 years that had gone by between us. Now, the fact remains, we're married, we have family, those type of changes. But as far as temperament, personality, the camaraderie, the deep feelings of respect, they're there. And I'm sure for the rest of my life they'll be there.
There were obviously dangers and trauma to be found in the war. In spite of that, American soldiers in Vietnam found some humor in their situation.
Every Vietnam veteran had that same instant of realization when you stepped off that plane, because you've been in an air-conditioned cabin for 20, 24 hours, and you step out into that heat, and it hits you in the blast, and you think, I'm going to die of heat prostrate before I get to the bottom of the stairs.
I'm sitting there, hovering, and there's gunshots all over the place, and airplanes just over me and around me. And my co-pilot hits me on the shoulder and says, look at your knees. And I looked at my knees, and my knees were just shaking like this. And I stare at him. He stared at him. We just started hooping. I couldn't stop him from shaking, but the helicopter was just as stable as it could be. So everything was in here. We got the guy up and flew out of there. And it was just one of the many experiences that we had.
And And we had been out there for 5 months. I mean, we'd been on fire bases and all, but this group of guys, and I decided we needed to do something just to change the routine. So I told everybody that we were going to have an open house with families and kids and everything in a barracks inspection. And they all looked at me like I was absolutely crazy. And I said, no kidding, next Saturday, we're going to do that, guys. We're going to have an open house, barracks inspection, then we're going to have a family picnic. And we actually did that in the woods. Now, what did we do? Well, first of all, we found out, I had to call back to the rear to find out what day of the week it was, and it turned out it was Thursday. So Saturday morning, after we had our night defensive position broken up, we just moved about 300 meters and found this real nice hillside. Said, all right, guys, everybody lay out your rucksacks and take everything out. And then me and the first sergeant went around and looked at what they were carrying in their rucksacks, because they tend to carry too much stuff. And police some of that out. You need to get rid of this. And then we had them all. We said, all right, we'll just set up perimeter security. And we spent 3 hours taking the extra food that we had kind of collected and making the most wild dishes that they could. And let them, build little fires to cook it all and just have a picnic like that. And they thought I was crazy, but at the same time, it kind of reminded them, and I think of everybody, that, hey, there's a world back there that we have completely lost touch with, except for the occasional letter that you would get. And it was an attempt at humor. They enjoyed it, and they thought I was crazy. But that's all right. I mean, being crazy is okay.
The nation was shocked by Kennedy's assassination in late 1963, and Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in as president. LBJ had plans for his Great Society, programs that would attempt to answer some of the social concerns of the time. He planned to make quick work of the Viet Cong guerrillas in South Vietnam and deliver a warning to their supporters in the North, as well as their Soviet and Communist Chinese backers. When a North Vietnamese gunboat attacked the U.S. destroyer Maddox in August 1964, President Johnson got the mandate he needed. Congress enacted the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving LBJ the authority to do whatever he felt necessary to ensure the independence of South Vietnam. By the end of the following year, there were over 150,000 American soldiers serving in country. Back home in the United States, we were inspired by the space program, and the war received only moderate attention during the build-up years, 1965 through 1967. Suddenly, the nation was stunned by a widespread, coordinated communist attack in many areas of South Vietnam during the Tet, or New Year Offensive of 1968. The effort was a complete defeat for both the dwindling Viet Cong guerrillas and the main force North Vietnamese Army. Battered, they retreated to sanctuaries in Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam. Ironically, the American and South Vietnamese victory was positioned as a defeat for American policy. The already vocal student protesters were encouraged, and there was widespread attention on those who condemned the war effort. A weary President Johnson announced that he would not seek a second elected term. American casualties had increased dramatically during 1968. During the course of the war, 58,000 American soldiers made the ultimate sacrifice. Their names are recorded for all time in the black stone of the Vietnam Memorial in Washington. But even for the 98% who returned home, Americans have come to believe that many, or even most, were somehow permanently damaged by their wartime experience.
Well, the Vietnam veteran is the person next door. They're the high school buddies that everyone grew up with. They're college classmates that everyone has and is familiar with. They're no different from anyone else.
When I came home, I didn't go around advertising I was a Vietnam vet because I did not want that stigma attached to me.
I believe we came back too quickly. A few days before that, we were in Vietnam and the jungle and the fighting that had taken place, and almost waking up. You wake up in a country that's a great country, but we didn't have the opportunity to make a transition from Vietnam to the United States.
Well, I felt a lot older than my years. I felt like an old man.
I was Carl Drost. I was me. I was back home. I'm going to go do my thing, and life is going to go on.
There are people who served at a time when the country was in a controversial war.
The kids that I grew up with were like children, and I couldn't relate to them anymore.
I really didn't have the camaraderie that I had just left, and the secure bases that I had in Vietnam.
Well, I think Vietnam veterans today are basically an important cross-section of our society. They're in business and industry and professions, and they actually have gone on and led successful lives. Most of them don't advertise the fact that they're Vietnam veterans very much.
It was only as of this last April when we had our class reunion and I chatted with all my buddies again, perhaps just knowing that they were safe and they came back and their families they're done well. Their families have done well. Their professions, they've all have their individual professions, but they're doing very well. They're a big cornerstone of America's society and a positive part of America's society.
The Vietnam vet I see as just being a local individual. He's just a common man who just, at that time, wanted to do his job and served his country, which was the thing to do at that time. That's what we were told by our dads. They had served in World War II, and they just basically wanted us to serve and do a good job at it and be proud of your country.
These are the individuals that you know if there's an accident on the highway, they will be the first individuals to get out there and assist. They've been tested.
My personal exposure to and service with the folks that I served with in Vietnam, the folks that I have served with since Vietnam, thousands, many of them Vietnam veterans, of course, right after I got out, that it was not the type of individual that you would see sometimes portrayed by the media and or by movies.
By and large, all the numbers, all of the scholarship that's got credibility to it shows that those people have come out of the war better than people who didn't serve. I mean, the fact of the matter is, and it is a fact, that Vietnam veterans are better educated than those who didn't go. They have a higher per capita income than those who didn't serve, and overall, they've just done a lot better.
Richard Nixon was elected in 1968 with a promise to end the war in Vietnam honorably. Soon after he took office, the planned withdrawal of American forces began, with no particular reduction in enemy hostilities. Virtually all American combat troops were shipped home by early 1972.
I was kind of remorseful. Here was this unit that I'd worked with, and I mean, we were physically going out of existence on like December the 6th or whatever of that year. And I remember going down and turning the property book in Saigon and coming back, and all the guys had been shipped home, or a few went to that last unit that was still left over there.
You know, about halfway through my tour was when Nixon announced that they were going to start troop withdrawals. And one of the first units that they pulled out was the 4th Division, which happened to be the major presence in the Central Highlands of American troops to protect that part of Central Vietnam. So it caused quite a stir amongst the local Vietnamese, us American troops that were there that were not part of the 4th Division. Felt like our major source of protection was being taken away because we knew there were 2 or 3 divisions of NVA troops in the area.
And yet there was a war still going on. It was like, we got all these people, all this equipment, and you're asking us to get on the plane and walk away from it all? But I mean, we haven't won yet. What about all these Vietnamese over here and the ARVN that we've been working with? And I was appalled.
And of course, a lot of the guys just felt like, hey, man, I don't want to be the last one here. I don't want to be, the last one killed in a war that doesn't mean anything anymore, because it's obvious that we're pulling out.
And then when I got back to the United States, it was like the U.S. Army had totally forgot that we were there anyway.
I must say that the morale just went in the tank at that time.
I remember I had the opportunity to talk to the Secretary of the Army, because a friend of mine was the general counsel, and I went into his office. He said, I hear you just got back from Vietnam. And I said, yes. He said, well, what are your concerns? I said, that this Army is aware that you still have people over there, a lot of them, that day to day we're still fighting. And I said, I can't, you guys aren't even looking at that.
And of course, everybody was counting the days to when they could get out of there, and I wasn't any different than anybody else. I was ready to come home.
Like Robbie Robinson and Bob Martinez, the remaining American soldiers had good reason for concern. Encouraged by the unilateral American troop withdrawals, 20 North Vietnamese combat divisions again attacked the South in the Easter Offensive of 1972. The enemy's all-out assault was again turned back with a modest loss of territory. Casualties were high among both the communist attackers and the South Vietnamese defenders. The disheartened communist leadership responded by moving closer to an American-sponsored agreement to end the hostilities. The Paris Peace Agreement was signed in January of 1973. The treaty prohibited further military advances by the communists. Ironically, the agreement was the first official admission by the North Vietnamese that they had ever been in South Vietnam. The United States got the principal point we had bargained for, the return of 591 American POWs. Our prisoners of war came home to great fanfare, their welcome underscoring a sharp contrast with the reception that had awaited the other 2.5 million returning Vietnam veterans. Denver CPA Tom Rodriguez remembers the day he got his orders to come home.
I was happy, beyond happiness, totally elated. That's when I got the order. Within 5 minutes, I actually didn't want to come home. My friends were there, and I didn't want to leave them.
When I came home, it wasn't much of a welcome. A lot of the people really weren't really concerned whether you were there or where you were at that time. I had the first time I came across one of my teachers went to school with, I had in school. She was surprised to see me. She says, "Oh man, you look great. You have a great tan. You look good. Where have you been?" And I told her where I was, and she said, "Oh, okay." And then that was the end of that conversation. She just went on to talk about something else.
Realistically and probably euphorically, I thought we getting off the airplane would have some type of welcome waiting for us.
When I came home, we landed at El Toro Marine Corps Base and took a bus to LA International and just walked through the terminal in uniform and basically was pretty much ignored for the most part.
Plane dropped at Tumble, Iowa, and my wife and daughter and my parents were there. And we had a great homecoming. Came to Oskaloosa, Iowa, nobody even knew I was back. It was just, yeah, well, he's back in church, and that's the way life is, and life went on.
And flew all the way back to Cleveland and was ignored there pretty much.
Did that bother me? No. I figured nobody owed me anything. It was, I answered my draft call because that was my duty. That's what my dad did. And
it was kind of like, no big deal, you're home. And my folks met me at the airport, and we had a nice reunion when I got home. But it was really pretty much anticlimactic.
I just never figured when I came home anybody owed me anything for going. It was just, that was just one of the things in life that happened along, and I was the only one out of my family that had to go, so for the family it was probably a small prize. Things
had a whole new importance or lack of importance based on my experience.
Since I came home in December of 1971, I don't think anybody cares that I was there.
Well, you know, even when I got home, my parents were you know, my dad was career military, but he'd been retired for a couple of years, so his feelings about the war were being shaped more and more by what he saw on television.
During 1968, I went from the Tet Offensive in Vietnam in June back home and started law school in the fall and finished my first semester in law school the same year that I began with the Tet Offensive.
The attitude was, well, thank God that's over. You don't have to think about that anymore. Let's not talk about it. So it was just like they, too, sort of swept it away, but they did it with a lot of misconceptions.
It's like I'd been gone for 3 years, and I just came back, and I had to find a new life.
sure we've done some things wrong in this administration. And the top man always takes the responsibility, and I've never ducked it.
By 1974, the Watergate scandal consumed the nation and led to the resignation of President Nixon. In the absence of strong presidential leadership, Congress barred or severely cut back promised support for the South Vietnam military and severely curtailed aid of all kinds to the struggling republic. The North Vietnamese saw their opportunity and seized it. Urged by a massive influx of Soviet arms, the Communists had been preparing for a final attack since the peace agreement had been signed a year before. The North Vietnamese army invaded South Vietnam for a final time and took power officially on April 30th, 1975. Some Americans breathed a sigh of relief that it was all over. But for the families and loved ones of the 58,000 fallen American soldiers, it was a dark day in history, as it was for millions of beleaguered South Vietnamese.
You know, I got disheartened, I think, watching what was happening to America and the things that I knew that were being said on television, I knew were lies. But you had no power, no ability to counter those things. And of course, once that tide started that way, it became irreversible. I mean, you knew what the end was going to be, even though you couldn't quite envision the final scene. And of course, the final scene with tanks crashing the gates of, the palace in Saigon. And of course, that, great feeling of futility when that happens. You think all those people had died, and America pulled the plug and basically said, send them to the communists. We're not gonna pay the price anymore.
One of the dead was a very good friend of mine that I grew up with and went to grade school and high school with, and I often think back on him now and wonder what he'd be doing today had he lived.
I felt good about what we did when I was there. There are many ways that the war was fought that I think were flawed. I think if we decided, if we knew in advance the way that it was going to turn out, we might have done a lot of things differently. I mean, I feel very badly, and the hardest thing for me, is to remember the young men who didn't come home.
There were other guys just like him that were all-American guys. I mean, that may or may not made good grades in school, but they had dreams and hopes and were achievers and wanted to establish a good life. But yet, when duty called, they went and they served and did everything that was asked of them to do. With no questions. And I think this country should be really proud of those guys.
We had, to me, a sacred duty, particularly once we went in there, to stick it out, and we just cut off the South Vietnamese from, ammunition, supplies, everything else. We made what happened inevitable in the end, and that caused us problems for the next 20 years on the international scene.
The other thing I feel really sad about is what happened to the South Vietnamese people. A lot of them are here in the United States now, and I can't get over the feelings that I had when Saigon fell of how we let those people down. We promised them that we would help maintain their independence and their democracy, and then we just left, and I felt personally responsible for that and felt very bad. Still do to this day.
All told, America's longest war had spanned the administrations of 5 presidents and an entire generation. For the millions of American soldiers who served in Vietnam, it has remained one of the pivotal periods in their life.
I don't think you can ever serve in a war without being permanently affected by it. It invades your thoughts to a degree that no other experience in life really can compete with. I say no other, there may be some, but it certainly is up there at the top in terms of the kinds of experiences that you just don't ever leave behind.
A war experience will mature you overnight, and Vietnam did that for me. It grew me up.
Oh, I think my family was very proud about my service.
I think that my tour in the Army and my tour in Vietnam did me a lot of good.
I think there were some that didn't agree. Just as, the microcosm of the country, there was a strong disagreement about the policy. But I think, setting that aside, I think everybody respected the fact that I served.
We should want to share the dream that we have in America with people outside of America. At that time, for me being a young man, it just happened to be the people in Vietnam that we were trying to help.
I felt at that time that, well, I do. You know, we've always been told that we have lived in the greatest country and you should appreciate what you have. And I never did until I was over in country and I saw how people lived.
I am very proud that I served in the United States military. I still get a chill in my heart when they start playing the Star-Spangled Banner and the colors come by. I get upset when people can't put their hand over their heart, or when the flag is presented.
A Vietnam veteran should be proud simply because he did serve a good cause for a good country, his country and the country that he was over there trying to protect. There's nothing wrong with what he did and why he did it.
A kid that will, divorce himself of the politics, and his country says go do this, and he say, I owe this to my country, and he goes and does it. And I mean, that's what it's all about, is that guy or that gal.
Wars, by their very nature, are surrounded by uncertainties, and the Vietnam War was no exception. Looking back at the history of the period, we may rightfully ask questions about the future of our nation. Will the relative peace and prosperity of this time last? Will the freedoms that Americans enjoy continue to spread throughout the world? These are questions that remain. But one thing is certain. For over 2 centuries, one nation, made up of people of all the nations, has stood for those ideals. More than 11 generations of young men and women have been ready to make the ultimate sacrifice for the dignity of all men. Even in times of turmoil and discontent, just as they did in Vietnam, our citizens will be ready to answer the call. Every one of the men you have just met asked themselves a simple question. If I don't serve, who will? In the land of the free and the home of the brave, there is perhaps only one answer to that question.
The average soldier, the officers, the non-coms, we took that oath of service seriously. Duty, honor, country, and that's what we did.